Running Wolf, also known as Kazachi, was not just any scout. He was an Uruk-Ura warrior who had earned a reputation for his courage and loyalty. In 1876, when the Battle of Little Bighorn was looming, Running Wolf was among the elite group of scouts chosen to work alongside Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry Regiment. This was no ordinary assignment. The stakes were high, and the tension was palpable as the U.S. Army prepared to face the powerful Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces. Running Wolf's knowledge of the terrain and his insights into the movements of the native tribes made him invaluable to Custer's strategy. But let's set the scene. In the spring of 1876, Running Wolf, along with 6 other brave warriors, Young Hawk, Horns in Front, Tall Bear, Foolish Bear, Red Foolish Bear, and Charging Bull, set out on a journey that would forever cement their names in the annals of history. Their leader was none other than Big John, a seasoned Uruk-Ura scout who had seen many battles and knew the ways of both the native tribes and the army. Together, this band of warriors left Fort Berthold and made their way to Fort Stephenson, where they camped. Overnight, at Fort Stephenson, Big John, always vigilant, ensured they were prepared for the long road ahead. From there, they journeyed north of present-day Washburn, reaching Bismarck by noon. It was a pivotal moment as they crossed the river via steamboat, a modern marvel that contrasted starkly with the ancient lands they traversed. The following morning, the group was escorted by Gerard, who led them to the headquarters, where they were formally enlisted into service. The initial camp was humble, set at the foot of a hill, but soon they would join the soldiers in a more secure location farther from the river. The excitement grew as word spread that Custer, currently absent in Washington, would soon return, and the long-awaited expedition would commence. 6 days later, Custer returned, and with him came the first parade. Bobtailed Bull and Soldier were summoned to headquarters, where the former was appointed sergeant, a prestigious role among the scouts. Gerard, ever the organizer, instructed the group to prepare for the parade. They would march Indian style, a display of their heritage and strength, singing their native songs as they led the procession. Behind them rode Custer, a towering figure in his signature buckskin, followed by the white cavalry. The sight was one to behold. Scouts and soldiers, native and white, marching together toward an uncertain fate. Varnum, the chief of scouts, stayed close to his men, camping alongside them, while the army paused for the night, setting up camp with an orderly and cook to ensure their needs were met. The next day brought rain, halting their march, but spirits remained high. After the rain cleared, they continued, establishing a second camp west of the Heart River, which they dubbed Camp Number 2. The journey was arduous, but these men were no strangers to hardship. The scouts, ever resourceful, named the next stop Turkey Buzzard Camp, where 2 brave scouts, One Horn and Red Foolish Bear, were dispatched to carry the mail. The soldiers received their pay at the first camp, and a herd of cattle accompanied the army, ensuring food for the long march ahead. The terrain grew rougher as they reached Big Mountain, but the scouts were undeterred. They dined in a wide valley and established Camp Number 4, pressing onward the next day to the open prairie, where Camp Number 5 was set up near present-day Hebron. Rain once again delayed their progress, forcing them to establish Camp Number 6 near Young Man's Butte, where they ate on a muddy flat. The roads were heavy with mud, slowing the wagons, but the army pressed on, establishing Camp Number 7 beyond the butte. As they ventured further into the Badlands, the landscape became more hostile, yet the scouts continued to provide valuable insights into the terrain. By the time they reached a coulee east of present-day Dickinson, Camp Number 8 was established, and during the night, Red Foolish Bear returned with news. He had left Red Bear behind with a spent horse. Bobtailed Bull, ever the leader, organized a rescue party, retrieving Red Bear and returning him to camp by dawn. The next leg of the journey took them deeper into the Badlands, where they set up Camp Number 11. The conditions were harsh, but the men were resilient. Timber was felled for bridges, and each man was ordered to carry his own food, a testament to the grueling nature of the march. They soon reached the Little Missouri Valley, near Soldier Butte, where they established Camp Number 12. Snow fell that night, blanketing the camp in 2 to 3 feet of snow. The army was forced to halt for the day, waiting for the snow to melt. When the weather cleared, they pushed onward through the slush and mud, their team struggling to haul the heavy loads. At noon, they encountered Crow Bear, a Grossman scout on horseback who had come from Powder River with the mail. After a brief exchange, Crow Bear returned to Powder River, and the army continued without pause, eventually establishing Camp Number 14 at Beaver Creek. The journey continued through the open prairie, where the scouts spotted distant blue hills. This was Camp Number 16, a desolate yet beautiful stretch of land. As they approached the blue hills, they established Camp Number 17 near a coulee with cottonwoods, which the Dakota Scouts named Cottonwood Creek. By dinner time, they reached the foothills, continuing until they arrived at the confluence where Powder River meets the Badlands. Here, they set up Camp Number 18. It was at this juncture that Custer summoned Bobtail Bull and instructed him to send 7 scouts ahead to search for signs of the Dakota warriors. The chosen scouts were a mix of Dakota and Yurok-Yura, Young Hawk, Forkhorn, and One Feather from the Yurok-Yura, and Karoo, Martaksha Buffalo. Body and White Cloud from the Dakota. White soldiers accompanied them, marching in 2 lines. Their orders were clear. Do not return until they had found fresh signs of the Dakota and report back to the base camp at the mouth of the Powder River. Camp Number 19 was established there, where a steamboat waited, providing supplies. 2 ailing scouts, Horns in front and Charada, were left behind, cared for by Tall Bear. The scouts pressed on, sending reports back to Custer as they advanced further into enemy territory. As the tension mounted, the army crossed the Tongue River, setting up Camp Number 22.5 miles from its mouth. The following days saw them moving quickly, with the scouts constantly sending word back about the movements of the native forces. When they reached the Elk River, Camp Number 22 was established, a stark outpost on high ground. It was here that the gravity of their situation truly sank in. The army was deep in hostile territory, with the native forces gathering strength. Running Wolf, always at the front, continued to provide crucial information that could mean the difference between victory and disaster. And yet, despite the growing tension, there was an unshakable confidence in the scouts and soldiers alike. They had prepared for this moment, and they would meet it head-on. As dawn broke over Camp 24 at the flat near the mouth of the Rosebud River, the atmosphere was tense. Custer and his brother, Tom, arrived at the scout camp, where Soldier, Bobtail Bull, and Bloody Knife were waiting. Gerard, serving as interpreter, facilitated the discussion. It was here that Young Hawk shared news of a fresh Dakota trail discovered along the river, a crucial lead that could change the dynamics of the impending battle. Simultaneously, the steamboat arrived, unloading boxes of hardtack crackers, which the scouts eagerly opened. The bugle call echoed across the camp as the scouts saddled up, filling their leather bags with rations. Amidst this flurry of activity, Custer was preparing dispatches to be sent back to the base camp at the mouth of the Powder River. He assigned 6 scouts, Foolish Angry Bear, Running Wolf, Howling Wolf, Curly Head, Goose, and Young Hawk, to deliver these crucial messages. However, realizing the strategic importance of Young Hawk and Goose in tracking the Dakotas, Custer decided to retain them. The final 4 scouts selected were instructed to remain at the base camp once the dispatch was delivered. Reluctantly, the scouts began their journey at around 3 or 4 p.m., even though they would have preferred to stay with the main party. The scouts traveled relentlessly through the night, pausing briefly for breakfast, then continuing all day and into the next night. As the sun rose, they finally spotted the wagons at the base camp about 1.5 miles away. 2 Yurok-Yura scouts, charging up the hill and wagon, who had been left behind at Fort Lincoln, rode out to greet them. After a brief exchange, they continued to the base camp, arriving around noon. Upon arrival, the scouts were immediately assigned to deliver new dispatches from Fort Lincoln to Custer, this time accompanied by a white soldier. Running Wolf led this group, which included Howling Wolf, Horns in front, Tall Bear, Charging Up the Hill, and Curly Head. They set off once again, riding until the middle of the night, when fatigue forced them to camp. The next morning, they resumed their travels, reaching a suitable campsite near the Rosebud by dusk. As the sun rose the following day, they arrived at the mouth of the Rosebud, where the crates of hardtack had been unloaded. In the distance, they saw what they believed were Dakota warriors, prompting them to quickly take cover in the timber along the river until nightfall. Tall Bear suggested returning to the base camp, but the accompanying soldier, using a mix of hand signs and basic Dakota words, insisted they were duty-bound to deliver the dispatches to Custer. He proposed that they cross the Rosebud under the cover of darkness and circumvent the potential threat posed by the Dakotas. The scouts agreed, fording the river despite the waters rising to their armpits. After traveling through the night, they reached the mouth of the Bighorn by late afternoon the next day. There, they found a camp of soldiers, which they presumed to be Custer's trail, though darkness and uncertainty about the Dakotas' presence kept them wary. Little did they know, the group they had observed near the Rosebud was actually Strike Two's party, returning to the base camp after the fateful engagement at the Little Bighorn. As the scouts reached the Bighorn camp, they began to learn of the battle's grim outcome. General Terry, whom the Yurok scouts referred to as Bear Coat because of his distinctive bearskin coat, commanded the camp. The shocking news was that Custer's forces had suffered devastating losses. While the full details were still murky, the steamboat that had ascended the Bighorn was carrying both survivors and wounded soldiers from the battle. At around noon, Crow Bear and a white soldier arrived from the base camp, bringing more details of the defeat. The report was devastating. Nearly all the white soldiers and many scouts had fallen. Crow Bear listed the fallen scouts: Bloody Knife, Bobtail Bull, Little Brave, Forthorn, Red Foolish Bear, Young Hawk, and Goose, all unaccounted for, as they had not been seen with the two groups retreating to the base camp. In the aftermath of this news, Terry himself visited the scout camp, handing Running Wolf a pair of field glasses and instructing him to ride to the hills above the Bighorn to keep an eye out for the returning steamboat. Running Wolf, accompanied by Charging Up the Hill, set off to fulfill this duty. That night, they returned to report no sighting of the steamboat. The following morning, Terry reiterated the instructions, once again entrusting Running Wolf with his personal field glasses. This time, he also asked Howling Wolf to join the reconnaissance effort. Upon their return for dinner, Running Wolf handed back the field glasses to Terry. Later that afternoon, at around 3 or 4 p.m., a sharp whistle sounded upstream, signaling the approach of the steamboat. The scouts, along with the soldiers, rushed to the riverbank. They were greeted by the sight of a white canvas covering the deck, beneath which lay the wounded soldiers, seeking relief from the harsh sun. At the bow of the steamboat stood Strike Two, a wounded Crow scout, signaling to those on the shore. As the wounded were offloaded onto the bank, Running Wolf spotted Goose near the engine room, his hand bandaged and wrapped in a blanket. Running Wolf, accompanied by another scout, helped Goose up the bank. Exhausted but relieved, Goose recounted the harrowing battle with the Sioux. "We fought hard, but were encircled by the enemy in the timber. It was only by sheer luck that we managed to escape," he added. The other scouts are following behind the boat on foot. Shortly afterward, the white survivors appeared, followed by 4 scouts: Young Hawk, Red Foolish Bear, Forthorn, and Half Yellow Face, a Crow scout. As Young Hawk approached, he began recounting the grim tale of the battle's aftermath. "Bloody Knife, Bobtail Bull, and Little Brave have fallen," he said somberly. "We found the bodies of the first 2, their heads brutally smashed. But Little Brave's remains eluded us." The somber mood weighed heavily on the camp as the full scale of the disaster became clear. The scouts' bravery was unquestioned, but the toll of the battle was staggering. Running Wolf, now among the few remaining scouts, felt the burden of survival and the loss of his comrades deeply. As the steamboat prepared to continue its journey, Terry gathered the remaining scouts, acknowledging their bravery and promising that their efforts would not be forgotten. The war was far from over, but the Battle of Little Bighorn had become a defining moment in the conflict, marked by both heroism and tragedy. With heavy hearts, the surviving scouts turned their attention back to the task at hand. The Dakota forces remained formidable, and the campaign would continue. But for Running Wolf, the memories of that fateful battle would be etched in his mind forever, a reminder of the cost of war. and the resilience of those who fought on the front lines. As the sun set over the Bighorn, the scouts gathered around the fire, each lost in their own thoughts, the embers of the fire mirroring the flickering hope for a better future beyond the conflict. As the dust settled from the intense battle at Little Bighorn, young Hawk led the spotted pinto, formerly Little Brave's mount, back to camp. His voice was steady, yet laced with a deep sense of loss as he recounted the brutal skirmish in the timber and the subsequent events in the ravine. The following morning, the wounded soldiers, including Goose, boarded the steamboat. General Terry, along with the commanding officer known to the scouts as Chief with a Red Nose, took charge. They tasked the remaining scouts with a critical mission: follow the east bank of the Yellowstone and locate any Dakota crossing points to the western side. Among the scouts were Fork Horn, Horns in front, Red Foolish Bear, charging up the hill, Tall Bear, Young Hawk, Running Wolf, and Wagon. Curly Head and Howling Wolf remained behind with Terry's main camp. For 10 days, the scouts searched diligently before returning to Terry's camp, only to discover that Soldier was missing and the camp had moved to the mouth of the Rosebud River, merging with the base camp at Powder River. With renewed urgency, the commanders ordered the scouts to continue up the Rosebud in pursuit of Sitting Bull. Halfway up the Rosebud, they encountered General Crook, who was leading a contingent of infantry and mounted scouts, consisting of Arapaho and Shoshone warriors. The entire scouting force, including Terry, Chief with a Red Nose, Varnum, Crook, and their respective men, joined together, following the Dakota Trail toward the Tongue River. The next day, they advanced to the dense timber along the Powder River, establishing a temporary camp. By dawn, the soldiers who had survived the Little Bighorn battle gathered at the camp, joining the Yurok-Yura and Arapaho scouts under the leadership of Terry and Varnum. They proceeded to the mouth of the Powder River, where they set up another camp. Meanwhile, Crook's forces, along with the remaining cavalry, paused their pursuit. The Crow Scouts and Arapaho returned to their reservations, while the rest of the troops regrouped at Crook's camp on the Rosebud, only to find that Crook had already resumed his pursuit of the Dakota Trail. When the chief with a red nose arrived at the scout camp, he brought a letter with orders to select 7 scouts to deliver it to Crook. The chosen scouts, Soldier, Black Fox, Charging Up the Hill, Boy Chief, Young Hawk, Running Wolf, and Carew, departed immediately. Upon delivering the letter to Crook's camp, they learned that Crook was still hot on Sitting Bull's trail. He instructed the scouts to stay and provide reconnaissance, with reports to be submitted every other day. As the scouts approached Beaver Creek, Running Wolf and Young Hawk took a brief detour to hunt along a ridge before rejoining the rest of the party. As they returned to camp, they encountered a group of Indian scouts on foot and cavalrymen under a different commander. Sir R.U., who had been sent to Powder River with the mail, returned with new orders. Soldier, Boy Chief, Black Fox, and Charging Up the Hill were to assume his duties. With rations dwindling, the scouts shared a meager meal: 2 crackers, 2 spoonfuls of coffee, and 2 spoonfuls of sugar each, before attempting to rest. But around midnight, the sound of approaching hooves shattered the silence. The Dakotas, mounted and heavily armed, attacked the camp, catching the soldiers off guard. The soldiers, some still half asleep and weaponless, scrambled out of their tents as the Dakotas closed in, firing relentlessly. Amid the chaos, the soldiers retreated to a nearby ridge, managing to return fire despite the darkness. The bugles finally sounded, spurring the cavalry into action. They quickly saddled up and joined the battle. After an intense exchange of gunfire, the Dakotas withdrew into the darkness. The scouts, positioned on a small hill, played a minimal role in the engagement but observed the fierce combat below. By morning, the soldiers abandoned their pursuit of the Dakota Trail, moving towards Soldier Butte, where they set up camp. As they reached the Little Missouri, they found an abandoned Dakota campsite and rested for the night. Around noon the next day, they discovered another deserted Dakota camp in the timber. However, the commanding officer forbade any engagement with the enemy, opting instead to establish camp on Custer's former site east of Rosebud Butte. They arrived there by late afternoon. As dusk approached, the scouts noticed unusual activity among the cavalry. prompting Carew to investigate. Young Hawk, sensing the need for urgency, summoned Running Wolf and explained, "The soldiers are preparing. Letters to be sent to Fort Lincoln. We're tasked with delivering them tonight." After a quick supper, the scouts set off at sunset, carrying the dispatches for Fort Lincoln. They rode throughout the night, only pausing briefly to rest and feed their horses at Young Man's Butte. Resuming their journey, they pressed on until they reached Sentinel Butte under the cover of darkness. With no time to spare, they continued through the following day, finally arriving at Fort Lincoln as night fell. In January 1877, Running Wolf's service with the Army officially ended, marking the conclusion of his duties in the Great Sioux War of 1876. Through it all, he had demonstrated immense bravery and dedication, navigating treacherous landscapes and fierce battles to support the Army's objectives. Yet the toll of these events was immeasurable, not just for Running Wolf but for all who had participated in this historic conflict. As we reflect on Running Wolf's experiences and the broader context of the Battle of Little Bighorn, it's clear that this was not just a battle of military might, but also a clash of cultures, each fighting for its survival and way of life. Stay tuned to this channel for more in-depth stories and first-hand accounts from various battles. I hope to continue bringing you insights into history's defining moments. Thank you for watching, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you soon